Captain James Morrison woke up at exactly 5:30 in the morning, just like he had done every single day for the past 12 years. His small apartment near the palace was quiet and clean. Everything had its place, and every morning followed the same routine. James believed that being a royal guard meant being perfect in every way possible. He walked to his bathroom and looked at himself in the mirror. At 34 years old, James was tall and strong with broad shoulders that filled his uniform perfectly. His brown hair was always cut short and neat. His blue eyes were sharp and alert. James took pride in his appearance because he knew that millions of people from around the world would see him standing guard at the palace. James made his breakfast, which was always the same thing: 2 pieces of toast with butter and jam, 1 cup of black coffee, 1 glass of orange juice. He ate slowly while reading the morning newspaper. The headlines talked about normal things like politics and sports. Nothing seemed unusual or dangerous about this Tuesday morning in July. After breakfast, James put on his famous red uniform. The jacket was bright red with gold buttons that sparkled in the light. His black pants had a perfect crease down the front. His tall black hat with the white plume made him look even taller than he already was. James checked himself in the mirror one more time before leaving his apartment. The walk to Buckingham Palace took exactly 15 minutes. James knew every crack in the sidewalk and every building along the way. London was waking up around him. People were walking to work carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Cars and buses filled the streets with their usual morning noise. The city felt normal and safe. When James arrived at the palace, he saw his fellow guards already taking their positions. There were 8 guards total who worked the morning shift. They had all been friends for years. They trusted each other completely. Each guard knew that the others would protect them no matter what happened. James walked through the palace gates and nodded to the other guards. They nodded back, but nobody spoke. Once they were on duty, the guards were not allowed to talk, laugh, or even smile. They had to stand perfectly still like statues. This was one of the most famous traditions in all of England. The palace grounds were beautiful in the morning sunlight. The grass was perfectly green and cut short. Flowers bloomed in neat rows along the walkways. The palace building itself was huge and magnificent, with hundreds of windows that reflected the golden morning light. James felt proud every time he saw it. At exactly 8 o'clock, James took his position at the main entrance. This was the spot where he had stood guard for more than 4,000 days. He knew every stone in the ground beneath his feet. He could see the iron gates where tourists would gather to take pictures and wave at the guards. The first tourists started arriving around 8:30. James could see families with children pointing at him and taking photos. Some kids would try to make him laugh by making funny faces or telling jokes. James never moved or changed his expression. He had been trained to ignore everything except real danger. An older woman from America asked her husband to take her picture standing near the gate. She smiled and waved at James. A group of school children from France pressed their faces against the iron bars trying to get a better look at his uniform. Their teacher told them in French to be respectful and quiet. James scanned the crowd with his eyes while keeping his head perfectly still. This was something he did automatically after years of training. He looked for anything that seemed wrong or dangerous: bulky jackets that might hide weapons, people who acted nervous or suspicious, anyone who seemed too interested in the guards or the palace security. Everything looked normal and peaceful. The tourists were happy and excited to be visiting London. The weather was perfect with bright sunshine and no clouds. A gentle breeze made the flags above the palace wave slowly back and forth. Birds were singing in the trees that lined the palace grounds. James felt relaxed and content. He loved his job protecting the royal family. He was proud to be part of such an important tradition. He had no way of knowing that in just 3 hours his peaceful world would be turned upside down forever. The perfect morning was about to become the most terrifying and mysterious day of his entire life. Marcus Webb stood at the back of the growing crowd of tourists gathered outside Buckingham Palace. His clothes were wrinkled and dirty from sleeping on park benches for the past 3 nights. His dark hair was messy and unwashed. His green eyes were filled with anger and pain that had been building up inside him for months. 6 months ago, Marcus had been a completely different person. He worked as a manager at a small office in downtown London. He lived in a nice apartment with his wife Sarah and their cat Whiskers. They had been married for 5 years and talked about starting a family soon. Marcus thought his life was going well and that he had everything under control. But then everything started falling apart at once. The company where Marcus worked lost several big clients and had to let half of their employees go. Marcus was one of the people who lost their jobs. He tried to find new work, but every place he applied said they were not hiring or that he did not have the right experience. Without his job, Marcus could not pay the rent on their apartment. He and Sarah started fighting about money every single day. She worked part-time at a coffee shop, but her small paycheck was not enough to cover all their bills. The stress of being broke and unemployed made Marcus angry and depressed. Sarah tried to be supportive at first, but Marcus became difficult to live with. He would stay in bed all day or sit on the couch watching television and feeling sorry for himself. He stopped looking for work and stopped taking care of himself. Sarah begged him to try harder, but Marcus had given up hope. 3 months ago, Sarah packed her clothes and moved back in with her parents. She left a note saying she still loved Marcus but could not watch him destroy himself anymore. She took their cat with her. Marcus came home to an empty apartment that felt cold and lonely without the people he loved most. 2 weeks later, Marcus got an eviction notice from his landlord. He had not paid rent in 3 months and had to move out immediately. Marcus packed his few belongings into 2 suitcases and left the apartment where he had been happy. He had nowhere to go and no money to rent another place. Marcus spent his first night sleeping on a bench in Hyde Park. The ground was hard and cold. People walked by him like he was invisible. He felt ashamed and embarrassed that his life had become such a disaster. He wondered how he had gone from being the successful manager to being homeless in just 6 months. During the day, Marcus would walk around London looking for free food and places to stay warm. He went to job interviews, but employers could see that he was homeless and desperate. His clothes were getting dirtier, and his appearance was getting worse every day. Nobody wanted to hire someone who looked and smelled like he had been living on the streets. The anger inside Marcus grew stronger each day. He was angry at his old boss for firing him. He was angry at Sarah for leaving him when he needed her most. He was angry at all the people who walked past him without offering help. Most of all, he was angry at rich people who had money and comfortable lives while he had nothing. Marcus started spending time near expensive hotels and fancy restaurants watching wealthy people eat good food and wear nice clothes. He would stare at them with hatred burning in his chest. These people had everything while he was sleeping outside and digging through garbage cans looking for food. Yesterday, Marcus walked past Buckingham Palace and saw the tourists taking pictures and having fun. He watched the guards in their perfect uniforms protecting people who lived in luxury beyond imagination. The sight of all that wealth and privilege made his anger boil over into rage. That night, Marcus used his last £5 to buy a hunting knife from a pawn shop in a rough part of the city. The knife was sharp and heavy in his hand. As he held it, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. If he could not have a good life, then he would make sure people remembered his name. He would do something that would shock the world and make everyone pay attention to his pain. Marcus Webb pushed through the crowd of tourists outside Buckingham Palace. His heart was beating fast, and his hands were shaking with nervousness. The hunting knife was hidden inside his old jacket where nobody could see it. He had been walking around the palace gates for 30 minutes trying to build up enough courage to do what he had planned. The tourists around Marcus were having a wonderful time. Children were laughing and pointing at the guards. Parents were taking pictures and videos to show their friends back home. An elderly couple from Japan was holding hands and smiling as they looked at the beautiful palace. Nobody noticed the angry homeless man standing among them. James Morrison continued standing perfectly still at his post by the main entrance. His red uniform was bright in the morning sunshine. His black hat sat perfectly straight on his head. He had been trained to ignore the crowds of people, but his sharp eyes were always watching for any sign of trouble or danger. At exactly 11:43 in the morning, Marcus made his move. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out the sharp hunting knife. The blade was 6 inches long and gleamed like silver in the bright sunlight. Several tourists saw the knife and started screaming in fear and panic. Marcus ran toward the iron gates that separated the tourists from the palace grounds. His legs were weak from not eating proper food for days, but anger gave him strength. He grabbed the top of the 6-foot-tall fence and pulled himself up and over with surprising speed for someone in his condition. The crowd of tourists scattered in all directions. Mothers grabbed their children and ran toward the street. Fathers shouted warnings to their families. The elderly Japanese couple held each other tightly and moved as fast as they could away from the danger. People were crying and screaming as they tried to get to safety. James heard the commotion and turned his head to see what was happening. His military training kicked in immediately when he saw a man with a knife running straight toward him across the palace grounds. James had been prepared for situations like this, but it had never actually happened during his 12 years of service. Marcus was now running directly at James with the knife raised high above his head. His face was twisted with rage and desperation. He was shouting angry words, but James could not understand what he was saying because of all the noise and confusion around them. James quickly calculated his options. He could not use his rifle because there were still innocent people nearby who might get hurt. The attacker was moving too fast and was too close for James to call for backup. He would have to defend himself with his bare hands against a man with a deadly weapon. Marcus was now only 20 feet away from James and closing the distance quickly. James could see the wild look in the man's eyes and knew that this person was beyond reasoning with. This was not someone who wanted to talk or negotiate. This was someone who intended to cause serious harm. James braced himself for the attack. He had been trained in hand-to-hand combat and knew how to disarm someone with a knife. But Marcus was desperate and unpredictable, which made him very dangerous. James would have to time his defensive moves perfectly, or he could be badly injured or killed. Marcus was now just 10 feet away. James could see every detail of the hunting knife as it reflected the morning sunlight. The blade looked sharp enough to cut through his uniform and deep into his body. Time seemed to slow down as James prepared to fight for his life. Then Marcus did something that surprised everyone, including James. Instead of trying to stab the guard up close, Marcus suddenly stopped running and drew his arm back. He was going to throw the knife like a spear directly at James' chest. James realized he was in terrible danger. The thrown knife would be much harder to defend against than someone attacking up close. The blade was heavy and sharp, and Marcus was throwing it with all his strength from close range. James tried to move out of the way, but he knew the knife would reach him before he could dodge it. The knife left Marcus' hand and flew through the air in a perfect straight line toward James' chest. The blade spun as it traveled, making a soft whistling sound. James watched it coming toward him and knew that in 2 seconds his life might be over. The hunting knife spun through the air toward James Morrison with deadly accuracy. The blade caught the morning sunlight as it flew, making it flash like a piece of lightning. James could see every detail of the weapon that was about to end his life. The wooden handle was dark brown and worn smooth. The steel blade was sharp and pointed directly at his heart. James tried to move to his left, but he knew he was too late. The knife was flying too fast, and he was standing too close to Marcus. Physics and mathematics were working against him. The weapon would reach his chest in less than 2 seconds, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Marcus stood frozen after throwing the knife. His arm was still extended from the throwing motion. His mouth was open, and his eyes were wide with a mixture of anger and fear. Part of him wanted to hurt someone who represented everything he hated about his unfair life, but another part of him was horrified by what he was doing. The tourists who had not run away were watching in complete terror. A mother from Germany covered her young son's eyes so he would not see the guard get stabbed. An older man from Australia was trying to call the police on his mobile phone, but his hands were shaking too much to dial the numbers properly. The knife was now just 3 feet away from James' chest. He could see the sharp point getting larger as it came closer to him. He thought about his parents who lived in the countryside outside London. He thought about his girlfriend Emma, who was probably at work right now not knowing that the man she loved was about to die. Then something happened that nobody could explain or understand. The knife suddenly stopped moving forward. It did not slow down gradually like something that hits a wall or gets caught in a net. It simply stopped instantly, as if an invisible hand had reached out and grabbed it in midair. The blade hung motionless exactly 2 feet away from James' chest. James stared at the knife in complete shock. His brain could not process what his eyes were seeing. The weapon was floating in the air, with no support underneath it and nothing holding it up from above. It looked like a magic trick, but this was real life, and there were no hidden wires or mirrors involved. Marcus' jaw dropped open even wider when he saw his knife stop in midair. He had thrown it with all his strength and watched it fly straight toward the guard. Now it was just hanging in empty space like it was stuck in invisible glass. He blinked his eyes several times, thinking he must be seeing things that were not really there. The tourists began pointing and gasping in amazement. Some of them started taking pictures and videos with their phones, even though they were still scared. A teenage girl from Canada whispered to her friend that this had to be some kind of special effect or illusion that was part of the palace tour. For approximately 3 seconds, the knife remained perfectly still in the air. It did not wobble or turn or move in any direction. The morning breeze that was strong enough to move the flags above the palace had no effect on the floating weapon. Birds flew past it, but the knife stayed exactly where it had stopped. James continued staring at the impossible sight in front of him. He had been a rational, logical person his entire life. He believed in science and facts and things that could be proven and explained. But he was looking at something that defied every law of physics he had ever learned in school. Then the knife began to move again, but not in the direction anyone expected. Instead of continuing toward James or falling to the ground, the weapon started floating gently downward like a feather drifting on a calm breeze. It moved slowly and smoothly without spinning or tumbling through the air. The blade landed softly on the stone pavement at James' feet. It made almost no sound when it touched the ground. The knife looked completely ordinary now that it was no longer floating in midair. It was just a regular hunting knife that someone might use for camping or fishing. There was nothing magical or special about its appearance. James looked down at the weapon near his boots. Then he looked up at Marcus, who was still standing 20 feet away with his mouth hanging open. Then James looked at the crowd of tourists who were all staring at him and talking excitedly in different languages he could not understand. The impossible had just happened in front of dozens of witnesses on a busy Tuesday morning outside one of the most famous buildings in the world. A knife thrown with deadly force had stopped in mid-air by itself and then gently floated to the ground like it was being controlled by some invisible supernatural power. James felt his legs getting weak and thought he might fall down from shock. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it beating in his ears. He was alive and completely uninjured, but he had no idea how or why he had been saved from certain death or serious injury. Within 30 seconds of the knife landing on the ground, the entire area around Buckingham Palace became chaos. Palace security guards came running from every direction with their radios crackling with urgent messages. Police sirens could be heard getting closer as emergency vehicles raced through the London streets toward the scene. Marcus Webb stood completely still like he was in a trance. His arms hung limply at his sides, and his face was pale white with shock. When the first security officer reached him, Marcus did not try to run away or fight back. He simply raised his hands above his head and allowed himself to be handcuffed without saying a single word. James Morrison remained at his post, staring down at the knife near his feet. His fellow guards arrived and formed a protective circle around him while they waited for the police to take control of the situation. James wanted to tell them what had happened, but he could not find the right words to explain something so impossible. The tourists who had witnessed the event were talking excitedly among themselves in many different languages. Everyone was trying to describe what they had seen to the people around them. Some were showing the videos they had recorded on their mobile phones. Others were calling their friends and family members to tell them about the miracle they had just witnessed. Detective Inspector Sarah Chen arrived at the palace gates 15 minutes after the incident occurred. She was a small woman with short black hair and intelligent dark eyes. Sarah had been investigating crimes in London for 18 years and had seen almost everything. But she had never been called to investigate something like this. Sarah spoke first to the security guards who had arrested Marcus. They told her that the suspect had not resisted arrest and had not said anything since being taken into custody. Marcus was sitting in the back of a police car looking confused and frightened. Sarah decided to interview the witnesses before talking to him. The first person Sarah interviewed was Mrs. Helen Schmidt from Germany, who had been visiting London with her family. Mrs. Schmidt spoke English very well and was able to give a clear account of what she had seen. She insisted that the knife had definitely stopped in mid-air with no explanation. Mrs. Schmidt said she had watched the entire incident from beginning to end. She saw the man climb over the fence and run toward the guard with a knife. She saw him throw the weapon directly at the guard's chest. Then she saw the knife stop moving forward and hang in the air for several seconds before floating gently to the ground. Sarah interviewed 12 more witnesses from 6 different countries. Every single person told exactly the same story. The knife had stopped in mid-air by itself. Nobody had seen any wires or hidden devices that could have caused this to happen. Several people had recorded videos on their phones that clearly showed the impossible event. Sarah examined the knife carefully. It was a standard hunting knife that could be purchased at any outdoor equipment store. The blade was sharp, and the handle was made of ordinary wood. There was nothing unusual about the weapon that could explain why it had behaved in such a strange way. Sarah also interviewed James Morrison, who was still shaken by his experience. James was known as a reliable and honest man who had served as a royal guard with distinction for 12 years. He had never been involved in any kind of trouble or controversy during his entire career. James told Sarah exactly what he had seen and experienced. He said the knife had been thrown directly at his chest and would certainly have injured or killed him if it had not stopped in midair. He insisted that he had not imagined what happened and that he was completely sober and alert at the time. Sarah asked James if he had any enemies who might want to hurt him. James said he could not think of anyone who would wish him harm. He lived a quiet life and had never been involved in any arguments or conflicts with other people. The attack appeared to be completely random. Sarah requested copies of all the security camera footage from around the palace grounds. There were 8 different cameras that had recorded the incident from various angles. When Sarah watched the videos, she could clearly see the knife stopping in mid-air, just as all the witnesses had described. The footage showed Marcus throwing the knife with considerable force. The weapon flew straight toward James and then suddenly stopped moving forward approximately 2 feet from his chest. The knife remained motionless for about 3 seconds before slowly descending to the ground. Sarah had the videos examined by technical experts to determine if they had been altered or edited in any way. The experts confirmed that the footage was completely authentic and had not been manipulated. The cameras had recorded exactly what had happened without any tricks or special effects. Sarah also had the knife tested by forensic scientists. They found Marcus' fingerprints on the handle, which proved he had been the person who threw it. But they could not find any evidence of hidden devices or special materials that might explain the weapon's unusual behavior. After spending 6 hours at the scene, Sarah had interviewed every witness and examined all the physical evidence. She had never encountered a case like this in her entire career. Every piece of evidence supported the same impossible conclusion. A knife had stopped in mid-air by itself and then gently floated to the ground. Detective Inspector Sarah Chen returned to her office at Scotland Yard that evening with more questions than answers. She had been investigating crimes for nearly 2 decades, but had never encountered anything that challenged her understanding of how the world worked. The case of the floating knife was going to require a completely different approach than any investigation she had handled before. Sarah spread all the witness statements across her desk and read through them again carefully. 15 people from 7 different countries had seen the exact same thing happen. The knife had stopped in mid-air without any visible cause and then floated gently to the ground. These were not unreliable witnesses or people with wild imaginations. The witnesses included a retired physics teacher from Scotland, a bank manager from France, and a medical doctor from Australia. These were educated, intelligent people who understood the difference between reality and fantasy. Yet they were all claiming to have seen something that was scientifically impossible. Sarah called Professor David Hamilton at the University of London. Professor Hamilton taught physics and had written several books about how objects move through space. Sarah asked him to examine the security camera footage and give his professional opinion about what had happened. Professor Hamilton spent 3 hours studying the videos from different angles. He used computer software to measure the speed and trajectory of the knife as it flew through the air. His calculations showed that the weapon had been thrown with enough force to travel 30 feet and cause serious injury to anyone it hit. Professor Hamilton told Sarah that according to every law of physics, he knew the knife should have continued moving forward until it hit something solid. There was no known force in nature that could have stopped the weapon in midair and then caused it to float gently downward like a feather. Sarah also contacted Dr. Margaret Foster, who worked at the Royal Institute of Technology. Dr. Foster was an expert in materials science and had studied unusual properties of metals and other substances. Sarah asked her to examine the knife to see if it was made of any special materials. Dr. Foster ran comprehensive tests on the hunting knife. She used X-rays and chemical analysis to study every part of the weapon. The blade was made of ordinary steel that contained iron carbon and small amounts of other common elements. The handle was carved from regular oak wood. There was nothing unusual about the materials used to make the knife. Sarah arranged for the knife to be tested at a government laboratory that specialized in examining evidence from unusual crimes. The scientists there used the most advanced equipment available to look for any hidden devices or special coatings that might explain the weapon's behavior. The laboratory tests revealed nothing unusual about the knife. It had no electronic components, no magnetic materials, and no chemical coatings that could have affected how it moved through the air. The weapon was completely ordinary in every way that could be measured or detected. Sarah interviewed Marcus Webb 3 times during his first week in custody. Marcus was being held at a secure facility while awaiting trial for assault and weapons charges. He had recovered somewhat from the shock of what had happened, but still seemed confused and frightened. Marcus told Sarah that he had bought the knife from a pawn shop in East London 2 days before the incident. He had paid £5 for it, and the shop owner had not told him anything special about the weapon. Marcus said he had never seen or heard of a knife that could stop itself in midair. When Sarah asked Marcus why he had attacked the guard, Marcus struggled to give a clear answer. He said he had been angry about losing his job and his wife leaving him. He had wanted to hurt someone who represented the wealthy, privileged life he felt he could never have. But he insisted he had never intended for the knife to behave in such a strange way. Sarah visited the pawn shop where Marcus had bought the knife. The owner was an elderly man named Albert, who had been selling used items for over 40 years. Albert remembered Marcus because he had seemed nervous and desperate when he bought the weapon. Albert told Sarah that the knife had been in his shop for about 6 months. A young man had sold it to him along with some camping equipment after returning from a hiking trip in Scotland. Albert had examined the knife carefully before buying it and had noticed nothing unusual about it. Sarah tracked down the original owner of the knife. His name was Robert, and he was a 25-year-old student who enjoyed hiking and camping. Robert said he had bought the knife new from an outdoor equipment store and had used it for normal camping activities like cutting rope and preparing food. Robert was shocked to learn that his old knife had been involved in such a strange incident. He assured Sarah that the weapon had always behaved normally when he owned it. He had never seen it do anything unusual or impossible during the 2 years he had used it for camping. Sarah contacted experts from universities around the world to ask for their opinions about the case. Physicists from America, Germany, and Japan all studied the video footage and came to the same conclusion. What they were seeing was scientifically impossible, but appeared to be completely real. Some of the experts suggested that the incident might have been caused by an unknown natural phenomenon. Perhaps there had been unusual electromagnetic fields in the area or some kind of atmospheric disturbance that could affect moving objects. But none of these theories could explain why only the knife had been affected and not other objects in the same location. James Morrison returned to work the following Monday morning, but he was no longer the same person who had stood guard at Buckingham Palace for 12 years. The impossible event had changed something deep inside him that he could not fully understand or explain to others. He found himself thinking about life and death and purpose in ways he had never considered before. James had always been a practical man who believed in things he could see and touch and prove. He had never been particularly religious or spiritual. He went to church occasionally with his girlfriend Emma, but mostly out of habit rather than genuine faith. Now he found himself wondering if there were forces in the universe that human beings did not understand. The other guards treated James differently now. Some of them avoided him completely, as if they were afraid that whatever had happened to him might somehow affect them as well. Others asked him constant questions about what he had felt or seen during those impossible few seconds when the knife hung in midair. James could not give them satisfying answers because he did not have any himself. He had felt completely normal during the incident. He had not seen any bright lights or heard mysterious voices or experienced anything supernatural beyond watching the knife stop and float to the ground. The whole thing had lasted less than 10 seconds, but had turned his world upside down. Captain William Thompson was the head of palace security and James' supervisor for the past 8 years. Captain Thompson was a no-nonsense military man who did not believe in coincidences or miracles. He called James into his office to discuss what had happened and how it might affect his future duties. Captain Thompson told James that the incident had attracted worldwide attention to the palace guards. News reporters from dozens of countries were requesting interviews with James about his experience. The palace administration had decided that James should not speak to the media about what had happened. James was relieved to hear this because he did not want to become famous for something he could not explain. He just wanted to continue doing his job and protecting the royal family like he had always done. But Captain Thompson warned him that his life would probably never be completely normal again. James began visiting the small chapel inside Buckingham Palace during his breaks between shifts. The chapel was a quiet, peaceful place where he could sit alone and try to make sense of what had happened to him. He had walked past this room hundreds of times during his 12 years of service, but had never gone inside before. The chapel was decorated with beautiful stained glass windows that cast colorful patterns of light across the wooden pews. James would sit in the back row and stare at the simple wooden cross above the altar. He did not know how to pray properly, but he found himself asking silent questions about why his life had been spared. Father Michael was the palace chaplain who conducted services for the royal family and staff members. He was a kind elderly man who had served at the palace for over 20 years. Father Michael noticed that James had started visiting the chapel and approached him one afternoon to see if he wanted to talk. James told Father Michael about the incident with the knife and how it had affected his thinking about life and death. Father Michael listened carefully without interrupting or offering quick explanations. When James finished speaking, Father Michael said that sometimes extraordinary events happen to ordinary people for reasons that might never be fully understood. Father Michael suggested that perhaps James had been saved for a purpose that would become clear in time. He said that many people throughout history had experienced miraculous events that changed the direction of their lives. The important thing was not to understand exactly how or why it happened, but to consider how to use the experience to help others. James began reading books about religion and philosophy that he had never been interested in before. He wanted to understand different ideas about life and death, and whether there might be meaning and purpose beyond what could be seen with human eyes. Emma noticed that her boyfriend was becoming more thoughtful and serious than he had ever been. Emma worked as a nurse at a London hospital and was used to dealing with life and death situations every day. She had always been more spiritual than James and attended church regularly. She was not surprised that a brush with death had made James think more deeply about important questions. James started volunteering at a local homeless shelter on his days off from work. He served meals to people who had nowhere else to go and listened to their stories about how their lives had fallen apart. James thought about Marcus Webb and wondered if there had been opportunities to help him before he became desperate enough to attack someone. The homeless shelter was run by a charity organization that helped people find jobs and housing. James learned that many of the people staying there had lost everything due to circumstances beyond their control. Job losses, divorce, illness, and other problems had left them with nowhere to turn for help. James began donating part of his salary to the homeless shelter and other charities that helped people in need. He had never been particularly generous with money before, but now he felt compelled to share what he had with those who had less. Emma supported his decision and began volunteering at the shelter with him on weekends. James also started paying more attention to the tourists who visited Buckingham Palace every day. Instead of seeing them as potential security threats, he began noticing the joy and excitement on their faces as they looked at the palace and the guards. He realized that his job was not just about protection, but also about representing something beautiful and meaningful to people from around the world. The incident with the knife had lasted less than 10 seconds, but its effects on James' life were permanent and profound. He could not explain what had happened or why he had been saved, but he was determined to make his remaining years count for something more important than just standing guard and following orders. News of the impossible incident at Buckingham Palace spread around the world faster than anyone could have imagined. Within 6 hours of the event, videos recorded by tourists were being shared millions of times on social media platforms. News organizations from every continent sent reporters to London to investigate the story of the knife that stopped in midair. The British Broadcasting Corporation was the first major news network to report on the incident. They interviewed several witnesses and showed the security camera footage that clearly captured the impossible moment. The BBC science correspondent called it the most unexplained event he had covered in 30 years of journalism. CNN sent their top investigative reporter to London along with a team of camera operators and producers. They set up outside Buckingham Palace and interviewed dozens of tourists and local residents about what they had heard regarding the incident. The story was featured on their main evening news program and watched by millions of viewers worldwide. Social media platforms were flooded with discussions about the incident. Some people believed it was genuine evidence of supernatural forces or divine intervention. Others insisted it had to be an elaborate hoax or some kind of special effects trick. Arguments broke out between believers and skeptics in comment sections and discussion forums. Religious leaders from many different faiths offered their interpretations of what had happened. The Archbishop of Canterbury suggested that the incident might be a sign that divine protection still existed in the modern world. Islamic scholars in London said it could be an example of divine mercy preventing unnecessary violence and bloodshed. Hindu teachers spoke about the concept of karma and how good actions might be rewarded with protection from harm. Buddhist monks discussed the possibility that meditation and peaceful intentions could influence physical events in ways that science did not yet understand. Even leaders from smaller religious groups offered their own explanations for the impossible event. Scientists and skeptics worked hard to find rational explanations for what had happened. Some suggested that the security cameras might have malfunctioned in a way that created the illusion of a floating knife. Others proposed that unusual weather conditions or electromagnetic fields might have affected the weapon's flight path. A team of professional magicians examined the video footage to determine if the incident could have been created using stage magic techniques. They concluded that while it might be possible to create a similar effect under controlled conditions, it would be impossible to perform such a trick spontaneously in an open public area with multiple cameras recording from different angles. The case went to trial 3 months after the incident occurred. Marcus Webb was charged with attempted assault, possession of a dangerous weapon, and disturbing the peace. His lawyer argued that Marcus had been suffering from severe mental stress due to unemployment and homelessness when he made the attack. The trial attracted massive media attention from around the world. Reporters filled the courtroom every day to hear testimony from witnesses and experts. The judge had to impose strict rules about photography and recording to maintain order during the proceedings. James Morrison was the key witness for the prosecution. He testified about his experience during the attack and confirmed that the knife would certainly have injured or killed him if it had not stopped in midair. James spoke quietly and seriously about how the incident had changed his perspective on life and responsibility. Marcus Webb took the witness stand in his own defense. He appeared much different than he had on the day of the attack. His hair was clean and neat, and he wore a proper suit provided by his lawyer. Marcus had been receiving counseling and medication while in custody and seemed calmer and more rational. Marcus testified that he had been desperate and angry when he made the attack, but that he deeply regretted his actions. He said that seeing the knife stop in midair had shocked him into realizing how wrong he had been to try to hurt an innocent person. He asked James and the court to forgive him for what he had done. The prosecution presented all the physical evidence, including the knife and the security camera footage. Expert witnesses explained that there was no scientific explanation for why the weapon had behaved as it did. The case was unique in legal history because it involved evidence of an apparently supernatural event. Marcus' lawyer argued that his client had been mentally ill when he made the attack, and that the impossible nature of what happened proved that no real harm had been intended by divine forces or fate. He asked the judge to consider Marcus' mental state and his genuine remorse when determining his sentence. The judge spent 2 weeks considering all the evidence and testimony before announcing his decision. He found Marcus guilty of the charges but sentenced him to community service and mandatory counseling rather than prison time. The judge said he believed that Marcus had been genuinely changed by witnessing the impossible event and deserved a chance to rebuild his life. The trial verdict satisfied almost no one completely. Some people thought Marcus should have received a longer sentence for attempting to harm a royal guard. Others believed he should have been found not guilty due to his mental condition and the supernatural nature of what had occurred. James Morrison attended every day of the trial and was present when the sentence was announced. After the court session ended, James approached Marcus and told him that he forgave him completely. The two men shook hands while photographers captured the moment for newspapers around the world. The incident continued to be discussed and debated long after the trial ended. Scientists studied the case for years, trying to find explanations that fit with known laws of physics. Religious scholars wrote books and articles about the theological implications of the event. The knife itself became one of the most famous pieces of evidence in legal history. 5 years have passed since that extraordinary Tuesday morning at Buckingham Palace, and the mystery of the floating knife remains as puzzling today as it was on the day it happened. The incident has become one of the most documented unexplained events in modern history, yet no scientist or expert has been able to provide a convincing explanation for what occurred. James Morrison still works as a royal guard, but his life has expanded far beyond his duties at the palace. He married his girlfriend Emma 2 years after the incident, and they now have a baby daughter named Hope. James chose the name because he wanted to remember that even in the darkest moments, something good can happen that changes everything. James has become a popular speaker at schools and community centers around London. He talks to young people about making good choices and helping others who are struggling with difficult situations. James never claims to understand why the knife stopped or what supernatural forces might have been involved, but he encourages his audiences to believe that their lives have meaning and purpose. Emma continues working as a nurse at the hospital and supports her husband's volunteer activities. She says that James has become a more thoughtful and caring person since the incident. He pays attention to people who are having problems and tries to help them find solutions before their situations become desperate. The homeless shelter where James volunteers has expanded its programs to help more people find jobs and housing. James has helped raise money for the charity and has personally assisted dozens of individuals in getting back on their feet. He often thinks about how different things might have been if someone had helped Marcus Webb before he became desperate enough to attack someone. Marcus Webb completed his community service requirement and has rebuilt his life in remarkable ways. He now works for a nonprofit organization that helps unemployed people develop job skills and find work. Marcus speaks at conferences about homelessness and mental health issues, sharing his story as an example of how people can change when they receive proper help and support. Marcus has never tried to contact James directly, but he follows news about the Guard's volunteer work and charitable activities. Marcus feels grateful that his victim has used the experience to help other people rather than becoming bitter or angry about what happened. The two men have not spoken since the day they shook hands after the trial ended. The hunting knife remains in a secure evidence storage facility at Scotland Yard, where it continues to be studied by researchers from universities around the world. Advanced scientific instruments have been used to examine every molecule of the weapon, but no unusual properties or hidden devices have ever been discovered. Dr. Sarah Chen retired from police work 3 years ago, but she still receives calls from scientists and journalists who want to discuss the case. Sarah has written a book about her investigation titled The Impossible Evidence, which became a bestseller and has been translated into 15 languages. Professor David Hamilton has spent years trying to develop new theories of physics that might explain how a knife could stop in mid-air without any visible cause. His research has led to advances in understanding electromagnetic fields and quantum mechanics, but he admits that the Palace incident still cannot be explained using current scientific knowledge. The security camera footage from the incident has been analyzed by computer experts using the most advanced technology available. The videos have been examined frame by frame and enhanced using digital techniques that can reveal details invisible to the human eye. Every analysis confirms that the footage is genuine and has not been altered or manipulated in any way. Tourists still visit Buckingham Palace every day, and many of them ask the guards about the incident with the floating knife. The current guards are not allowed to discuss what happened, but most visitors already know the story from news reports and internet videos. Some tourists bring cameras hoping to witness another impossible event. The chapel inside Buckingham Palace has become a place of pilgrimage for people who believe the incident was a genuine miracle. Father Michael reports that attendance at services has increased significantly since the story became famous. People from many different religious backgrounds come to pray and reflect on the meaning of what they consider to be divine intervention. Scientists continue to propose new theories about what might have caused the knife to behave so strangely. Some suggest that quantum effects, normally invisible at large scales, might occasionally influence everyday objects. Others propose that consciousness itself might have the ability to affect physical reality in ways that are not yet understood. Skeptics still argue that the incident must have been caused by some kind of hoax or trick that has not yet been discovered. They point out that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that a single unexplained event should not overturn centuries of scientific understanding about how the physical world works. The debate between believers and skeptics continues in academic journals, scientific conferences, and online forums. Each side presents compelling arguments, but neither can definitively prove their position. The incident remains a fascinating puzzle that challenges our understanding of what is possible in the physical world. Documentary filmmakers have created several movies about the incident, featuring interviews with witnesses, experts, and the people directly involved. These films have won awards at international festivals and have introduced the story to new audiences around the world. The most popular documentary has been viewed more than 50 million times online. Museums have created exhibits about unexplained phenomena that feature the Palace incident as their centerpiece. Visitors can watch the security camera footage and examine detailed models showing how the knife stopped in midair. These exhibits attract millions of visitors each year who want to learn about events that science cannot yet explain. The incident has inspired artists, writers, and musicians to create works exploring themes of mystery, wonder, and the possibility that reality contains more than what can be measured or understood. Novels have been written using the event as inspiration for stories about miracles and supernatural protection. Songs have been composed celebrating the idea that good can triumph over evil in unexpected ways. James Morrison often reflects on how a single moment lasting less than 10 seconds changed not only his own life, but also affected thousands of other people around the world. He believes that sometimes extraordinary events happen to remind human beings that the universe contains mysteries that may never be fully solved or understood. Whether the incident was caused by divine intervention, unknown natural forces, or something else entirely may never be determined with certainty. What cannot be disputed is that a knife thrown with deadly intent stopped in mid-air without explanation and gently floated to the ground. This impossible moment continues to inspire wonder, hope, and questions about the true nature of reality itself. The mystery endures, and perhaps that is exactly as it should be. In a world where science and technology can explain almost everything that happened, some events remain beautifully and permanently beyond human understanding. The floating knife at Buckingham Palace stands as proof that the impossible can still occur when we least expect it, and most need to believe in something greater than ourselves.